Hello and welcome back to the Week in 7 Questions, today with Jamie Shea. Jamie, you've left NATO 2 years ago. In what shape do you see the alliance these days?
Well, good morning, Roland. If you look at the fundamentals, and that's what matters, I think NATO is in good shape. All of the members are committed to collective defense, the core mission. NATO has been spending a lot more money on improving its military capabilities. NATO has been taking up some important new challenges like China, out of space, and dealing with disruptive technologies. And of course, finally, we now have with Joe Biden, a US president who really likes NATO and is going to be much more committed to modernizing NATO for the 21st century.
So, is Joe Biden's election in the US actually good news for the West? Asking for a friend.
I think it's good news in the sense that Europeans will be listened to in Washington and taken seriously in a way that, quite frankly, they weren't during the Trump years. Biden is a committed multilateralist, and he'll work better with the Europeans on many of the big challenges like climate change or dealing with the pandemic. But in giving more, he will also expect more burden sharing from the Europeans in return. And this is going to be the less comfortable aspect of the Biden presidency.
But President Macron called NATO brain dead last year. What was he thinking, quite literally?
I think that Macron was frustrated by the fact that some allies, particularly the United States, but also Turkey, were taking unilateral decisions without prior consultation with allies or giving them any early notice. And in the case of Turkey, this exposed French troops in Syria to real risks. So Macron certainly believed that this was undermining NATO's cohesion and solidarity. He said that NATO was working well as a military alliance, but not as a political alliance. And I think he wanted to shake up the tree and get NATO to look at itself. And indeed, he was successful because NATO set up a group of experts, which has just reported on recommendations to improve NATO's political consultations. So some good may yet come out of this.
But there is a serious debate now about how serious Europe is about strategic autonomy or European sovereignty, whichever you prefer, right?
I think that you're right. It's a serious debate that's going on, but there are two things which are lacking. Firstly, a clear definition by the EU of what strategic autonomy means. Different people have different concepts. Is it just a military concept, or does it embrace things like supply chains, technology, dealing with pandemics, industrial sovereignty? So we need a clear definition. Secondly, we need more US support and backing for this. The US often sees that this is a challenge to NATO. So the Europeans need to develop in Washington a narrative that explains that it's not a challenge to NATO, and it's probably the only good way for Europe in the long run to share more responsibility alongside the United States.
Now, China is rising fast these days, also as a potential threat. And what should NATO do about that?
I think in the first place that NATO needs to analyze China more and understand China more. It's far more complicated than the old Soviet Union because it, of course, affects Europe and the United States in far more different domains, particularly in technology and in economics, and not just in the military domain. Once it's done the analysis, we need a common front in NATO towards dealing with China. It can't just be based on deterrence and containment. There has to be an element of engagement there. But it's obviously the case that if you put the EU and the US, North American economies together, you get up to nearly 40% of world GDP. And that's a much better basis on which to engage China constructively.
And Turkey is still a NATO member. But is it still a member of the West?
I would argue that in military and strategic terms, yes, it still is, because Turkey still contributes a lot to NATO in terms of troop deployments and being the home of big NATO headquarters like the Land Command at Izmir. But of course, in the political and value sense, things have changed and Turkey has moved away from the West. That said, Turkey is still a democracy. The opposition still wins elections, as we've seen in Ankara and Istanbul, and millions of Turks still look towards the West and the aspiration for EU membership. So as long as that's the situation, and despite all of the frustrations, Turkey has not yet left the West, and we still need to embrace Turkey while hoping for better times in the future.
Jamie, you being British, can you provide a 50-word script for an episode of The Crown set during the NATO intervention in Kosovo in 1999?
Well, I don't know if Kosovo would have been a good topic for a Netflix episode of The Crown, because obviously the royal family were much more involved in patriotic outpourings of joy, like in 1945 at the end of the Second World War, or of course when Margaret Thatcher regained the Falkland Islands in 1982. Kosovo was quite controversial in the UK. Some supported the humanitarian aspects of rescuing the Kosovo Albanians, while others, particularly the older generation, were quite horrified that NATO was intervening in Serbia, which had been an ally of the UK in World War I and World War II. So if the Crown had focused on Kosovo, I could imagine a lively debate between the older and the younger royals as to exactly whether NATO was doing the right thing or not. But I'm not sure it would have provided the drama that we've seen in other Crown episodes. And of course, the whole thing is fiction anyway, right?
Right.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Thank you all for watching, and see you again next week with the last surprise guest of this year, 2020.